Hello, I am Bob, and this is the Home Bitcoin Immersion Mining channel. In this episode, I'm going to cover getting my budget 120 volt immersion mining setup up and running, including all of the troubleshooting and rebuilding I had to do along the way. So with that, let's get started. But before getting into my build, I want to mention some sponsors of the channel, the first being Brains. Now, I've been using Brains products and services for a while now, and one thing I think is really cool is how the different parts of the Brains ecosystem work together. First, the Brains OS sits on top of your miner, optimizing your miner output and protecting it from overheating through its auto-tuning and dynamic performance scaling capabilities. The Brains toolbox can then be used to manage all of your miners remotely, allowing you to maintain the Brains OS in each miner individually or as batch operations. The Brains mining pool and the Brains app can then be used to monitor your whole mining farm performance, your rewards, and alert you if any of your miners have performance issues. And all of this works together out of the box. There's no code to write, and setup and configuration is really easy. And if you use all of this together, the only cost is the 2.5% dev fee. The pool fee is waived if you use the Brains OS on your miners. I think it's really cool to have a complete mining solution from a single source that pretty much does it all. Now my next sponsor is Scott's Crypto Mining and the Build a Mine Bootcamp. In the Build a Mine Bootcamp, you'll learn everything you need to know to launch your first megawatt of Bitcoin miners in less than 3 months. The Build a Mine Bootcamp is taught by Scott himself, and you'll be joined by other entrepreneurs and business owners like you who want to learn how to stack more sats faster through Bitcoin mining on an industrial scale. To get in on this fantastic opportunity, just click the link in the description below. And last up is a brand new sponsor of the channel, Altair Bitcoin Mining Solutions, which is a perfect match for home mining. Altair is your one-stop shop for any mining hardware you might need. They have everything from the latest and greatest miners to every hashboard, cable, and part you might need to repair your existing hardware or build your own 120-volt home-built miner. Altair has years of experience working in the Bitcoin mining industry, including running their own Bitcoin farm, and they've worked with all different scales of mining operations. Altair is based in the US and has top-rated customer support. And so if you have any question about anything at any time, they are there to help you out. Altair is a huge supporter of the home mining community, so if you're looking to buy your next miner or miner parts for your home setup, check out their website at the link below. You'll find pretty much everything you'll ever need. So in the last several episodes, I built up a budget immersion mining setup. This including building up a tank and pump, building up a 120 volt miner, and building and connecting a radiator to dissipate all that heat. I've got a link above to the playlist where you can catch up on all the details. And in the last of these episodes, I covered filling the tank and starting up the miner, but I didn't show much more because it didn't work. I had problems with both my miner and my immersion setup. And if you are building your own system or your own miner, as much as you might design everything right, this happens. Things don't always go as planned. So the intent of this episode is to walk through my troubleshooting and rebuilding steps and show how I got my mining setup back up and running. And so the first problem I had was getting my 120 volt miner to work. My T17 control board is an older control board and does not come with the right firmware to run my more modern S19K Pro hashboard. Now, I knew this was the case when I selected my components. The idea behind this build was to pick budget-conscious hardware and then find a way to make it work. So the plan was to install modern aftermarket firmware onto the old hashboard, which would then allow the old and new miner components to work together. I chose to use the Brains OS Plus firmware, so I formatted a 32GB SD card, flashed the firmware onto the card using the Balena Etcher tool, and inserted it into the SD drive on the control board and started up the miner. Now, this was supposed to be easy and just work, but it didn't. I could log onto the miner through the Brains OS Plus interface, but I couldn't connect the miner to my mining pool. Instead, I saw this view and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. So I started troubleshooting. I reformatted a new SD card, I re-downloaded and re-flashed the firmware, I looked at the log files, I searched the internet for similar problems. I even tried some things I knew wouldn't work, like running the T17 on its old stock firmware and using my incompatible Brains BCB100 control board, hoping I'd learn something new that might help. Troubleshooting can be really frustrating. You try again and again with different ideas and different approaches, with none of them working, but the key here is to stay patient, keep thinking, and try new things. And eventually, if you can't figure it out yourself, ask others for help. And in my case, I decided to get on the Loki Plebs Telegram group to see if anyone there could help. This group is a fantastic resource. They are experts on building 120 volt setups and getting things to work. They offered a bunch of different suggestions on what to try next, and more importantly, got me thinking a little differently about my setup. I took a whole new approach to setting up my mining pools. Instead of working through the firmware directly on my miner, I tried setting up the pools remotely through the Brains Toolbox application, and this worked. The Brains Toolbox easily found my miner on my home network, and I just used the Toolbox capabilities to add my pool information. I rebooted my miner and was up and running. Now, I still don't know why I couldn't add my mining pool directly from the Brains OS interface on the miner. Maybe it's just my old T17 control board being a problem. Maybe it's my mixing and matching of old and new components. Who knows? But I think this does highlight one of the advantages of using the Brains ecosystem. There's more than one way to fix your miner. In any case, I fixed the problem and was up and mining, but that's when the next problem surfaced. As my miner started hashing away, the temperature of my immersion fluid started to rise, and it kept rising and didn't stop. The fluid hit a temperature of over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this is where the dynamic performance scaling feature in the Brains OS Plus firmware was really useful. When I set up my miner, I set the maximum temperature to 77 degrees. So as the system kept heating up, the dynamic performance scaling slowly powered down and eventually turned off the miner. So this saved my miner from being damaged, which was great, but now I had to figure out why my radiator was not cooling my fluid. Now, I built my radiator from 4 2-foot lengths of baseboard radiator piping. Here's the chart from one of Kalefi's Hydronics documents, and if you do the math, it shows that the radiator should be able to dissipate around 700 watts. But this chart was developed for water-based systems, and so with dielectric fluid, which is a bit thicker and not as good at transferring heat, this might be lowered to as little as maybe 500 watts. And my single board miner was generating between 1,000 and 1,500 watts of heat, so I made a big mistake in my design. Somewhere along the way, I miscalculated. To make this passive design work, I would need a baseboard radiator around 3 times this size, or about 24 feet long. Now, that would not fit well on my mobile platform. I'm not sure if my little pump can handle that additional pipe length, and the additional radiators would really increase the cost of this budget build, so I needed to redesign my radiator. Luckily, way back at the beginning of my build, my first design idea was to use a water-to-air radiator and a fan to cool my miner. I purchased all of the hardware and was going to build that design, but then I changed my mind when I thought I could get away with these passive baseboard radiators. So all I needed to do was disconnect and remove the baseboard radiators and connect my water-to-air radiator and fan. Now, while I was figuring all of this out, I kept my miner off, but I kept my fluid pump running just to see if there'd be any other issues. And unfortunately, this is where my system had its final failure. After a couple days, I noticed that the fluid was no longer reaching the top of the miner tank. The pump was still circulating fluid, but it was somehow going around the separation wall. So I drained the fluid out of the tank, and what I found was that the silicone I applied between the plastic separation wall and the glass-walled tank was no longer holding. With the seal gone, the fluid was just passing sideways around the wall and not up through the miner. Now, I use silicone because silicone seems to stick to everything, and I figured this would work. But what I found was the silicone tended to peel away from both the smooth plastic and the glass. So again, I had to go into troubleshooting mode and think of something creative here. And my solution was just to use some sandpaper to roughen up the edges of the plastic wall so the silicone would stick a little better, and just be a little more careful when applying the silicone to the overall joint. I wasn't sure if this would be enough, but it was cheap and easy to try. I cleaned off the dielectric oil from the tank and plastic sheet using some dish soap and water, and used a razor blade to remove any silicone from the first build. I masked off and sanded the edges of the plastic using some 120 grit sandpaper. I reattached the separation wall with more silicone sealant, this time making sure I was a little more careful about sealing the edges of the plastic wall to the tank. And with the tank rebuilt and the old baseboard radiator removed, I attached my 12-inch radiator to my aluminum frame using some sheet metal screws. I added some fittings to adapt the 1-inch radiator output to the 3/4-inch PEX tubing, and then used more PEX tubing and clamp fittings to connect the radiator to the tank. The fan was then attached to the radiator using more sheet metal screws. This is an attic exhaust fan. These are fairly cheap and operate really quietly. It runs on 120 volt power, and I added a fan controller which will allow me to operate the fan at lower speeds, making it almost silent. After the rebuild, I dropped the miner back into the tank, added fluid, and turned everything back on. And I've had this system running non-stop for several weeks. The miner is running great, and the tank, the pump, and the radiator are keeping everything cool. So this is the final working design of my budget 120 volt immersion miner. And hopefully this gives you an example of what it's like to build a real system, and the types of troubleshooting and problem solving you might have to do to get everything working. As I noted in the last episode, this is why it might be a better option to pay a little more for a commercial system such as the Fog Hashing C1, where troubleshooting and rework isn't needed. Now this ends my last episode in my budget miner build series. Hopefully this gives you some ideas for your own home immersion mining setup. In my next episode, I'm going to shift topics a little and dig into exactly what miners are doing and what hashing really means. Hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss any new episodes coming your way. And with that, bye.